Okay, so this is the last topic for this class, for this whole semester, which is chi-square tests. And it's plural because we're going to discuss two different kinds of chi-square tests. And chi-square test is considered one of the so-called non-parametric tests. So the word parametric, parameter. So if we think about the z-test, t-tests, analysis of variance, correlation, regression, all those tests have a set of statistical assumptions. So those tests are considered parametric tests. And the chi-square test, on the other hand, does not have strict statistical assumptions. So there's still a few, but there were very few assumptions. So that's the reason why it's called non-parametric tests. So here's a kind of a basic, here's a big picture. And let's say we want to examine the relationship between two variables. And depending on the variables that we have, we use very different methods. So for example, correlation and regression analysis applies when we examine the relationship between two numeric variables. Both variables are quantitative, such as age and height, happiness and income, etc. So all those variables are numeric or quantitative. Now, if we have one variable is between subjects, one variable is categorical, and another variable, the dependent variable, is numerical, then we use t-test and analysis of variance. Then depending on the design of the study, whether it's between subjects, within subjects, we use different kinds of t-test and analysis of variance. Now, for this last topic, we're going to discuss tests that would allow us to examine relationship between two categorical variables. And that test is called the chi-square test of independence. Now, there are two types of chi-square tests. One is chi-square test of independence, and there's another one that's actually simpler. It's called chi-square goodness of fit test. And for both tests, the basic equation, the test statistic, is exactly the same. So let's take a look at the test statistic first, and then we'll look at a few examples that would allow us to conduct either a goodness fit test or a chi-square test of independence. So, test statistic. This test statistic was designed by Carl Pearson, the same person who was responsible for both Pearson's correlation and regression analysis. This is one of his another contributions to statistics, is he designed the chi-square test. If you want to type this chi-square test, you can say chi-squared, or just say, sometimes people just say chi-square. Or if you want to insert a Greek letter, it looks like X, but this is actually not X. And so if you just write it, you write it in this way. So it's like X, but the one leg is extended. So it is a chi-square. It's a Greek letter. And by the way, sometimes occasionally I hear students read this as chi-square. No, don't say chi-square. It's chi-square. Okay, it's a chi-square test. And if you see chi-square, nobody will know what you're talking about. So it's a chi-square test. So chi-square test, the calculation of chi-square equals sigma means sum, right? You add together this item. So for the numerator, you have two things. One is frequency observed. FO is observed frequency. How many times that you observe a certain event that happens. Minus F expected. So that's the how many occasions, how many times something happens, some certain event happens, according to the null hypothesis. So you have observed, subtract, expected, and you take the square of that, then divide it by F of expected frequency under the null hypothesis. And then you add across the number of cells, and then that test statistic is called chi-square. So this is the same. We have the same test statistic regardless of what type of chi-square test that we are talking about. Okay, so that's the test statistic. Now, let's take a look at the simple form of chi-square test. It's called the goodness of fit test. You can consider this as a sort of like a one-way chi-square test. One way in the sense that you have only a single categorical variable. So you don't have two, you just have one. And that categorical variable, of course, can have several different levels. Sometimes you have two, sometimes you have three. And the null hypothesis for a chi-square goodness fit test is that you hypothesize a specific percentage, a proportion that you want to test. So for example, let's say you have this idea that only 20% of people text when they drive. Okay? So you have a very specific hypothesis. In this case, it says 20% of people, they would send text messages when they drive. So the alternative hypothesis, of course, is the opposite of that. So it says the percentage of texting while driving is not 20%. And this is quite flexible. You can say 20%, your null hypothesis maybe it's a 50-50, or your null hypothesis can be it's 80%. So whatever that you decide, that is your null hypothesis. So you propose a specific set of proportions based on theory, based on some hunch, some whatever ideas you have. So you have a null hypothesis and you have alternative hypothesis. Now, suppose that you observed 100 people. Okay, so in this case, say n equals 100. Now, under this null hypothesis, if 20% of 100 they text when driving, so the expected frequency is 20, right? So 20% times 100 equals 20. So this is expected. Now, how many people out of the 100 that they don't text while driving? It's 80, right? So 80% times 100, you have 80. Now, what about your data? Let's say you made an observation, and your observation out of 100 people, you actually noticed 50 people. They did texting. They did texting when driving, and another 50 didn't. So now you have F expected under the null hypothesis, F expected under the null hypothesis, and then you have the data 50 and 50. So when we apply the equation, this is how we would apply this equation. So for the first category, you have observed 50 subtract 20, right? You take the square divided by expected frequency, which is 20. And then for the next category, you have 50 that's observed minus 80 that's expected, and take the square divided by 80. You add them together, so that's the sigma part, and you have chi-square in this case equals 56.25. Okay, so that's how you would calculate the chi-square test statistic for the goodness of fit test. And the other thing about chi-square is that we need to decide what is the degree of freedom. So for the goodness of fit test, degree of freedom, df, equals number of categories minus 1. So how many categories do we have? We have 2. Either text when driving or don't do text when driving. So 2 categories. So in this case, degree of freedom equals 1. So the question, with 1 degree of freedom, with chi-square equals 56.25, what is the critical value of chi-square? What is the region of rejection, right? So for that, we'll take a look at the chi-square distribution. And so this is we have a link on the content page for chi-square. There's a link that says chi-square. So if you click that link, it leads to a page that more or less looks like this. It's chi-square distribution, and we need to change the degree of freedom to 1. So with 1 degree of freedom, this is what the chi-square distribution look like. And p equals 0.05, so at alpha equals 0.05, the critical value of chi-square equals 3.838. In other words, any chi-square value that's greater than 3.84 is going to be in the region of rejection. And as a result, we would reject the null hypothesis. And our calculated chi-square equals 56. So 56 is way over here, right? So it is definitely in the region of rejection. And of course, another way to use this website is to type in the chi-square value. We have 56 point something, and it says p equals 0. Of course, p is never 0, but p is a very, very, very small number. So it's definitely p less than 0.000001, which means it's less than 0.05 alpha level. So we would reject the null hypothesis and conclude, no, the percentage of people who drive and do text and drive is not 20%. Okay, so we would reject the null hypothesis because the chi-square is somewhere over here, right? 56. So p less than 0.05. So we reject the null hypothesis. So this is basically the chi-square goodness of fit test. It's very straightforward, very simple, very easy to. This is one of the tests that you can actually run just by hand. And this is what the SPSS computer output of chi-square test of chi-square goodness of fit test looks like. So you have people who don't do that and people who does that. Observed is 50-50, expected is 20-80, and they call this residual. So 50 minus 20 equals 30, so that is residual. 50 minus 80, negative 30, that is residual. So take the square and divide it by expected frequency, add them together. You have chi-square equals 56.25. And with 1 degree freedom significance level, the p-value is less than 0.001. So we would report that result as chi-square in parentheses, degree of freedom equals 56.25, p less than 0.001. So we reject the null hypothesis that the percentage of texting when driving is 20%. So in other words, our conclusion is that it's not 20%. Okay, so that's one example, and of course, chi-square goodness of fit test is not limited to a situation in which there are only 2 categories. So here's another example. What about 3 categories? So think about the bill payment method. Pay by check, but use ePay, and use some other methods. So this is one variable, so it's still a one-way chi-square, right? It's a chi-square goodness of fit test. And so this is this categorical variable have 3 categories. And you can have a null hypothesis that the percentage of people who use check, ePay, or other methods are equal. So in other words, the percentage is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And then depending on how many participants you actually observe, the total number multiplies percentage, you have the expected frequency for each category, right? So let's say n equals, how about n equals 100 again, right? So the null hypothesis says they're all equal. So the percentage-wise is 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3. So what is the expected frequency in this case? Well, the expected frequency under the null hypothesis would be 100 divided by 3, which is the 33.333, etc. And for ePay is 33.333333. And for the other category is also 100 divided by or multiplies 3. So you have 33.3333. So that would be the expected frequency under the null hypothesis. Right? These are FEs. And then, depending on what you actually observe, how many people out of 100, how many people use check, how many people use ePay, how many people use the other payment. So you have FO. And then you use the chi-square, same chi-square equation. Chi-square equals sigma, let's say F observed minus F expected. That's the residual. Take the square and divide it by F expected. Okay? And so what is degree of freedom in this case? Well, degree of freedom equals the number of categories. How many categories do we have? We have 3. So K minus 1. So equals 3 minus 1 equals 2. So we have 2 degrees of freedom for the chi-square test. Okay, so this is just another example of chi-square goodness of fit test. So again, just to summarize, chi-square goodness fit test is something that you can use if you have a single categorical variable, but with multiple categories. And your basic research question is about a specific set of frequencies or relative frequencies that you propose. And you can use this equation to test this data. So it's a very useful method. Yes, so that's the null hypothesis, and that is the alternative hypothesis. Okay, so let's move on to the next test, which is the chi-square test of independence. So let's expand that example. So we still have 3 different kinds of payment. So the type of payment is one variable, categorical. Let's say the other variable is also categorical because we divide our participants into different age groups. So we have 3 categories for one variable, and we have 4 categories for another variable. And these are the observed frequencies. Okay, so among the 18 to 25-year-old, we have 10 use check, 70 use ePay, 20 use other. Now, if we look at the oldest age group, 70 uses check, 10 use ePay, 20 use other methods. So just kind of eyeballing these numbers, it looks like there is a significant relationship between the type of payment people use and their age group. So how do we test this? Conduct a significance test. Is the relationship between age group and the type of preferred payment related, or are they independent? Independent means there's no relationship, right? So this is why this test is called chi-square test of independence. So the null hypothesis is simply the type of preferred payment method is not related to age group. The alternative hypothesis is the opposite. So it is related. The 2 variables are related. So the null hypothesis says no, they are independent, and alternative hypothesis says they are dependent. There is a relationship between the 2. And so you can think of this as a 2-way chi-square test. 2-way in the sense that you have 2 categorical variables. And the purpose of the test is to figure out whether there is a significant relationship between the 2 categorical variables. Here's another example of this kind of 2 categorical variable situation. So suppose you conduct an ice cream survey, and you ask 2 questions. One is, what is your gender? Boy or girl? So it's categorical, right? You have 2 categories, girl, boy. And the second variable is also categorical. What flavor of ice cream do you like best? You have chocolate, you have strawberry, and you have vanilla. So you can imagine what kind of data you're going to obtain. Well, this is something we call a contingency table. So this is a 2 by 3 contingency table. So this is observed variable, observed frequency 22, 10. And strawberry, 10 girls and 30 boys. And vanilla, 14 girls and 10 boys. Now, with this case of this, these are the observed data, right? This is FO, observed. Now, how do we figure out the FE? What is the expected frequency under, how do we obtain the expected frequency under the null hypothesis? It turns out it's a very straightforward way to calculate that. So the basic equation to calculate the expected counts, the expected frequency, is to calculate the row total and the column total and the grand total. Okay, so if we add this way, 22 plus 10 equals 32. So this is the total for the row. And if we add them this way, 22 plus 10 plus 14, we have 46. Right? So this is the column total. And if we add them together, this 96 is the grand total. So for example, how do we figure out what is the expected frequency under the null hypothesis for girls who like chocolate? Okay, that's easy. So that's the cell, right? So we find the row total, which is 32, times the column total, which is 46. And we divide that by the grand total, which is 96. Okay, so what is that number? So 32 times, let's see, 32 multiplies 46 divided by 96 equals 15.33. So 15.33. Okay, so this is the expected frequency for this cell. I'm going to write this in red. So the expected frequency in this case equals 15.33. Okay, so let's calculate one more. What about for this cell? For boys and chocolate. Under the null hypothesis, we would expect 32 times column total is 50 and divided by the grand total, which is 96. Okay, so that equals 32 times 50, 32 times 50 divided by 96 equals 16.67. So 16.67 is the expected frequency for that cell, okay, for this particular cell. Now, you can do the exact same thing for the other cells, and then once you did all that, figured out all those expected frequencies, then we go through all 6 columns. So we would take 15.33, we would take 22 observed minus expected 15.33, take the square, divided by 15.33, plus 10 minus 16.67, take the square, divided by 16.67, and we go through each one of all 6 cells. And the result is the chi-square, right? So that is the chi-square. Now, how many degrees of freedoms do we have in this case? Well, that is determined in this way. So how many degrees degree of freedom do we have for gender variable? The answer is we have 2 categories, minus 1 equals 1. So we have 1 degree of freedom as far as gender is concerned. What about the type of ice cream? So how many different categories do we have for the type of ice creams? 3. So 3 minus 1 equals 2. Okay, so we have 2 degrees of freedom for ice cream. Now, combined for the entire test, it multiplies 1 times 2. So for this test, we have 2 degrees of freedom. Okay, so degree of freedom equals k minus 1 times j minus 1. So k is the number of categories for one variable, and j is the number of categories for another variable. So minus 1, you lose 1 degree of freedom for each variable. You multiply the result. The product is the degree of freedom of the chi-square test of independence. Okay, so that is essentially the chi-square test. So that is the end of this. This is the end of this short lecture. This is very straightforward, the method, chi-square test. And the textbook went into a little bit further because it talked about some of the basic data requirements, not exact statistical assumption, but more of data requirements. For example, you're not supposed to have any empty cells. And some would even argue that the smallest cell, you should have at least 5 cases. And there's also a measurement of effect size that comes with the chi-square, but for our purpose, we're just going to look at the very basics of these 2 types of chi-square test. So how do we calculate the chi-square? How do we interpret the results? How do we determine the degree of freedom? And that's it. Okay, so this is the end of this first lecture on chi-square test. And I have the second lecture, second video is going to be about, we are going to work on the examples for the activity worksheets.